Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. Today we're going to continue our journey through World War II. We're going to start the war itself, and we'll end today by bringing the United States into the war. And we'll talk a little bit about the war, certainly, as we get into it. We're looking right now at a photograph of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is going to be a very inspirational leader for the British. He's going to serve as Prime Minister for most of World War II and even a little bit afterwards. His leadership is going to prove to be very vital, especially during the Battle of Britain, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. But our first learning objective for today, we're going to be able to describe how we have these peaceful nations that are confronted by foreign aggressors, and in particular Germany, along with Italy as well, and certainly we will dive more into the Pacific theater a little bit later. But let's start with Europe. So France and Britain, where we left them off, Germany had just marched into Czechoslovakia, and there was some fear that Poland would be next. So when Hitler does decide on September 1st, 1939, to officially invade Poland, this marks the beginning of World War II, because France and Great Britain are going to see this action. They know they can no longer abide by this appeasement, and they need to, unfortunately, engage in a war that they had tried to avoid. And this is going to be the start of World War II. And so you're going to see Germany making its way again into Poland. Germans are going to call for a very swift and fierce attack on the Polish targets, which we would today call a Blitzkrieg or lightning warfare. It's often given this name because it's usually quite sudden. It involved the Luftwaffe, which would be the German Air Force, along with the armored tank divisions, and then typically kind of helping to sustain held areas by the infantry. And so certainly they are going to use this tactic. It's going to be very effective at the beginning of the war in Europe, and you're going to see it again throughout World War II. And certainly again, is known as lightning warfare. Fast forward a little bit to April of 1940, and the Netherlands and Belgium are certainly looking for some support from the Allied powers, which at this point, remember, Soviet Union and Germany have signed a non-aggression pact. It involves Britain and France, and they know that at this point that they need help. They fear that certainly a German attack would soon overwhelm them, and they needed help. And so later that year in June, the Germans are going to officially cross into France. And again, this is the beginnings of larger moves that they're going to make in France. But Germany is going to be joined by Italy. Italy is going to be coming up from the southeast. They're both going to be attacking France. And while they do their best, they unfortunately are not going to be able to hold back the Axis powers. And France is going to then surrender to the Germans after they take the capital of Paris. They're going to set up a kind of a provisionary government known as Vichy France, which of course will be under the leadership of the Nazi Party. And in the photograph here, you're looking at, of course, the Germans marching past the Arc de Triomphe, and certainly symbolizing their victory here. Again, you would have seen several stunned faces like these as the German occupation continues. One of the ways I usually help say for my students is think JIG when you think of the Axis powers, but certainly you could do, any sort of acronym that helps you. But Germany, Italy, as well as Japan are going to form the backbone of your Axis powers as we head into World War II. And again, you've certainly got Germany here, Italy here, and Japan in the lower right. Now, we introduced Winston Churchill here at the beginning of our video. He's again going to be the Prime Minister of Great Britain after once he wins re-election over election over Churchill. And he's going to provide a lot of inspiration to his people. And it's going to come just in time because in August of 1940, you're going to see that the Germans start to begin to bomb the British, and this becomes known as the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe, in particular, are going to target Air Force bases. They're going to look at shipyards. They're going to attack cities. Certainly the British people found themselves in tunnels and in bomb shelters pretty much daily during this time period. And people often looked to Churchill for hope and for guidance. And certainly they would certainly get both from him. This is from a very famous speech he gave on June 4th, 1940, over the radio. And for my students, we'll listen to this in class because I would much rather you hear it from him than from me, but we'll take a moment here just to read it. It says, "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." And again, his words were trying to uplift. And if you've ever seen, whether it's a meme or a GIF or anything that says keep calm and carry on, that comes from this time period in British history. Now, in a very surprising mood, in June of 1941, after having not been able to conquer Britain, Hitler puts his sights on the USSR, Soviet Union. Now, this is a little bit surprising because he just signed a non-aggression pact before the war had begun. He was trying to avoid that two-front war. But again, Germany wants more. In particular, Hitler wants more. And so in June 1941, the German forces again begin to invade the Soviet Union. Now, as the Soviets are forced to retreat further and further into the USSR, they start to use a scorched earth policy, which is going to make it harder for the Germans to really claim anything and be able to use that territory for their benefit. You're going to see a series of important kind of major cities in the USSR, but you're also going to see certainly at a very important stand at Stalingrad. And one of the things that Germany and Hitler weren't thinking about is how long this would take, because the Soviet Union, which is even bigger now than Russia is today, is going to take some time to occupy, and it would take some time to take over. And he underestimates how long it's going to take, and he finds himself here in the winter. And much like Napoleon had tried centuries before, they're both going to fail because you just don't want to try to claim Russia in the wintertime. So if you're ever thinking about taking over the world, lesson number one, don't attack the Soviet Union, or in this case, Russia, or in this case, the Soviet Union. Reverse that for me. Don't attack during the wintertime. So take a moment to check in question here. What was the Germans' fast and fierce style of attack referred to as? Was it called the Allied attack, the Axis attack, Blitzkrieg, or scorched earth? So take a moment and pause if you need to. But the best answer here is C, Blitzkrieg. All right, we're going to be able to explain how the United States is going to start to gradually get more involved in this European conflict, and in particular, why they decide to join the Allies. I think you've already got some ideas heading into this, and I'm guessing you're probably right. So, as the war began, the United States did vow to remain neutral again, not take sides, much like they did in World War I. But just like in World War I, eventually we're going to get pulled into this. Although we get pulled in a little bit sooner and on a much bigger scale in this war than we did in World War I. And President Roosevelt, FDR again, understands that while we want to remain neutral, he isn't sure how long we can keep that stance. And so he does take some actions to start to prepare for war. So in 1938, Congress takes steps to strengthen the Navy, which of course is going to prove to be very important for World War II, especially in the Pacific. And they also usher in the new Neutrality Act of 1939. This is going to allow for warring nations to purchase American goods as long as they paid cash and they could carry the goods on their own ship. trying to minimize damage to American ships and, of course, American lives that might be lost in transit. And then in 1940, Roosevelt signs the Selective Training and Service Act. Now, this does mean that people are being drafted into the military, and it's actually the first peacetime draft that we've had up to this point in American history. And it was, again, wanting to avoid war, but almost seeing it as a necessary step to be prepared, with the idea that maybe, just maybe, this war is coming and the United States is going to have to get involved. So again, a picture of people certainly going into training after being drafted, again, despite peacetime. Roosevelt is going to run again for a third term. And again, like we've talked about in class, he's going to get elected to a fourth term. Unfortunately, he's going to pass away before then. But that's that's another story for another day. So Roosevelt runs for a third term, and he's going to do this in 1940. He's going to win pretty easily, and he's going to defeat Wendell Willkie. Now, for my students, that's no relation to our beloved Mr. Willkie at our school, but for FDR, it is a pretty clear victory. So in March of 1941, Congress is going to pass the Len Lease Act. This is going to allow the United States to either sell, lend, or lease, very appropriately named bill, to any country that is seen as vital to the defense of the United States. And spoiler alert, most of these countries are allied powers. So it makes sense that that is going to be the side that the United States is going to choose. But again, anybody who we deem as important to supporting our own security and our own defense, we could lend, lease, and sell weapons or other military equipment to those nations. Before the U.S. enters into the war in August of 1941, Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt are going to meet together. They're going to draw up what's called the Atlantic Charter. And this is before the United States is even involved in the war. And basically, they're going to set goals for the world after the destruction of the Nazi Party, the defeat of Germany. One of this, they urged disarmament. Again, this is the removal of weapons and the creation of a permanent system of a general security. Again, this could be sort of the beginnings of the United Nations, or certainly could have been some other global organization that they were thinking about. The U.S. and Britain are also going to agree not to seek any territorial gains because of the war, although certainly some of that will come about when the war does end. And they stated that people should ultimately have more say in choosing their own form of government. Again, they'd seen the lessons from World War I. They certainly are going to see the lessons from World War II, especially with the rise of fascism and totalitarianism, to try to avoid those things for the future. And of course, we come to the event. Again, I always tell my students, I don't particularly think there's a lot of dates that you should memorize. We talk, of course, about there are a few that you really should know. July 4th, 1776 is certainly one of them. But another one that you should know, too, is December 7th, 1941, because it's on that day that the United States is going to enter into World War II. Not officially, but the event that happens on that day, certainly being the attack on Pearl Harbor, is what is ultimately going to bring the United States into the war. So while Hitler and Mussolini are waging war in Europe, the Japanese have been taking over, again, parts of Manchuria, the Koreas, certainly also making their way throughout a lot of Southeast Asia, with the idea of certainly wanting to control a lot of the Pacific. But what you're seeing, again, is plans on taking an American territory, that being the Philippines. Remember, Spanish-American War, this is now under is a protectorate of the United States. So in response, Roosevelt, again, having signed some peace agreements with the Japanese, is essentially going to try to take a non-military tactic here He's going to essentially freeze all Japanese funds in the U.S. banks, and he's going to stop the sale of oil, gasoline, and any other resources that Japan lacked in order to try to perhaps stop their advancements in the Philippines and then ultimately later in the Pacific. But again, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese warplanes end up attacking the American military base at Pearl Harbor in the state of Hawaii. And if you kind of want to get, again, a sense of the views, there's a couple of great images. Of course, for my students, we always watch a little bit. While not a great historical film, it does kind of give you a little bit of sense of the grandeur from the film of that day. But again, story-wise, it's got some inaccuracies for sure. But if you kind of want to get a sense of the waves, so the first wave hits at about 7:40 a.m., and this is on a Sunday, by the way. December 7th was on a Sunday. You can certainly see there's some Air Force bases on Oahu that were also targets that day. But again, the primary attack is on Pearl Harbor. A large amount of the U.S. Navy was sitting here. We did not expect them. We had peace agreements with the Japanese, and so this attack definitely took us off guard. And while sonar did detect something, it was largely passed off as just being something that we couldn't, or that we didn't fully understand. Also, the mountains in Hawaii made sonar a little bit less accurate as well. But again, we find ourselves certainly in Pearl Harbor here. You can kind of see these were some of the ships. The ones that are in red were sunk. The orange ones were heavily damaged. The yellow ones were moderately damaged. And then the black ones were the ones that were undamaged in the fighting. But you can kind of get a sense of where some of those ships were in the harbor that day. And again, I just wanted to share some photographs that were taken from that day. Again, this was a day that the United States was not expecting. A lot of men who were stationed at Pearl Harbor were still in their bunks on this Sunday morning because this was something that was not expected. A lot of bravery was shown this day. And this is one of those days that, depending on the generation, it seems to come, whether it's, in more modern generations, it might be the attacks of September 11th, or for some it was Kennedy's assassination. But there are these national moments that seem to define different generations. And certainly for the 40s, this was our defining event, Pearl Harbor. I always like to show students this dispatch too from the Naval. It basically gives a sense like this is not a drill, this is something that occurred. Unfortunately, on this day, more than 2,300 soldiers, sailors, and civilians were killed as a part of this action, with some claiming that number may be even a little bit higher. For students in my class, we'll be sure that we listen to this speech, but definitely when it comes to iconic moments in history, FDR speech, again, A Day Which Shall Live in Infamy speech, basically is calling on Congress to declare war on Japan. So the very next day, December 8th, the U.S. is going to declare war on Japan. Again, it was just seen as something that could not be tolerated. You had the death of over 2,300 people. There needed to be a response. And in many ways, Japan probably didn't realize it, but they had awoken a sleeping giant, one that, despite having gone through the Depression, was ready to rise. And so the Japanese allies, in turn, the other Axis powers, Germany and Italy, they're going to declare war on the United States. The U.S. is going to join the Allied nations, and then later declares war on Germany and Italy. And of course, you can go to Pearl Harbor today and get a sense of the get a sense of that day. And this is definitely something that would be on my list of places to go before I die. Certainly on the bucket list. So, all right, that's going to wrap up this edition of Mr. American's Moments in History. We went through a lot of history today. I apologize that this video is a little bit longer, but just wanted to make sure that we got to really talk about some good stuff today. So definitely check out the review here just to make sure. Again, remember you've got 6 options, but 5 questions. So again, you're not going to use one of them. And I'm guessing one of these is not going to sound familiar to you, and being that we didn't talk about it. So it's not coming till the end. But for my students, make sure if you've got any questions, please ask me. Otherwise, for those of you who are listening, really appreciate it and hope that we were able to maybe teach you something today. And we'll see you on the next episode of Mr. American's Moments in History. Thank you.